A German test pilot bailed out over enemy territory in 1945, certain the Americans would torture him to death. Instead, they did something that would change his life forever and prove why America won more than just the war. This is the story of Hans Werner Lurch and the moment one sergeant's decision rippled through the next 60 years. March 1945. Hans Werner Lurch's Messerschmitt was trailing black smoke over the Rhine Valley. American fighters circled above him like wolves, stalking wounded prey. He was 26 years old, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, and he was about to die in enemy territory. His hands shook on the control stick, not from fear of the crash, but from what would come after. If he survived the bailout, he would face American soldiers, and Hans knew exactly what that meant. For years, Goebbels' propaganda machine had filled every German mind with nightmares about American captivity. He had heard the stories in pilot briefings and mess halls. Americans tortured prisoners for information. They murdered German pilots on sight, especially test pilots who knew too many secrets. Some stories claim they handed Luftwaffe prisoners over to the Russians, which was a death sentence. Other whispers spoke of prison camps where men starved, where guards beat you senseless for speaking German. Hans was not naive enough to believe all the propaganda, but he had seen what happened to shot down American pilots in Germany. Some Wehrmacht units still followed the rules, but others did not. And the SS? They had killed Allied airmen just for surviving their crashes. He had heard about it firsthand from Wehrmacht officers who were disgusted by such violations of military honor. Why would the Americans be any different? Why would they show mercy to an enemy pilot who had spent 4 years helping refine the weapons that killed their brothers? The altimeter spun down, 2,000 feet, 1,500. Through his shattered canopy, he could smell burning oil and hydraulic fluid mixing with the cold March air. The fighter that hit him was long gone, probably already radioing his position to ground forces. They would be waiting for him. 1,000 feet. Time to jump or die. Trying. Hans grabbed the canopy release with his left hand, his right fumbling with the harness. The metal was slick. With his own blood, he had taken shrapnel in his shoulder when the first burst of .50 caliber rounds tore through his cockpit. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, warm blood soaking through his flight suit. He thought of his wife Hildegard and their daughter back in Bad Wurschofen. Would they even be told what happened to him? Or would he just disappear into some American camp, another name on a list that never came home? 500 feet. The Bavarian countryside rushed up at him, fields and forests he had flown over 1,000 times. Now, enemy territory. He pulled the release. The canopy tore away. Ice-cold wind blasted his face, stealing his breath. He hauled himself up against the G-forces and threw his body into the void. The parachute snapped open, jerking him hard enough to make him gasp in pain from his shoulder. Below, his Messerschmitt augured into a farmer's field in a shower of earth and twisted metal. Smoke billowed black against the blue spring sky. 4 years of test flying, hundreds of hours evaluating every fighter the Reich produced. And it ended here, drifting down into enemy hands with nothing but his flight suit and the knowledge in his head. Knowledge the Americans would torture out of him. He could see them now, soldiers running across the field toward his landing spot, rifles raised, jeeps bouncing along dirt roads, kicking up dust. They would be on him in seconds. This was how it ended. Everything his superiors had warned him about was about to come true. But Hans Werner Lurch was about to discover something that would shatter everything he had been told about the enemy. And 30 years later, he would still be trying to understand in times repay times what happened in the next 60 seconds. Hans hit the ground hard, his injured shoulder exploding in white-hot pain. He collapsed into the dirt, tasting blood and earth, gasping. His parachute dragged him several meters across the muddy field before he managed to slap the quick release with his good hand. The silk deflated like a surrender flag. He lay there for a moment, trying to breathe through the pain. Above him, the sky was impossibly blue, peaceful, indifferent to the war being fought beneath it. He could hear boots pounding closer, American voices shouting words he could not quite make out over the ringing in his ears. This was it, the moment every German pilot dreaded. Hans forced himself to his knees, then his feet, swaying. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the spring grass. He raised his right hand slowly, palm open, the universal gesture of surrender he had practiced in his mind 100 times, but never thought he would actually use. The American soldiers emerged from the tree line, 5 or 6 of them, United States Army infantry, rifles trained on his chest. They were younger than he expected. Farm boys mostly, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion. The lead soldier, Hans, could see the sergeant's stripes on his uniform was shouting something, probably ordering him not to move. Hans's legs trembled beneath him. He kept his hand raised, trying to convey with his eyes that he was not a threat, that he was wounded, that he just wanted to survive the next 60 seconds. His mouth was too dry to speak. Even if he could find words, his English was terrible. He knew technical aviation terms, but little else. The sergeant approached cautiously, rifle leveled at Hans's head. Hans could see the man's finger on the trigger, see the calculation in his eyes. Another soldier circled behind him. Hans felt hands patting him down roughly, checking for weapons. They found nothing, just his blood-soaked flight suit and the Iron Cross pinned to his chest, which one soldier ripped off and pocketed without ceremony. Luftwaffe, the sergeant said, looking at Hans's wings insignia, then louder to his men. We got ourselves a Kraut pilot. Hans understood that much. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but only managed. Ich bin, I am. The words died in his throat. The world tilted at odd angles. The sergeant studied him for a long moment, taking in the blood, the pallor of his face, the way Hans swayed on his feet like a tree about to fall. Hans saw something shift in the American's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. One soldier seeing another soldier in trouble. Then the sergeant did something Hans never expected. He lowered his rifle. Get the medic! The sergeant called over his shoulder, his voice sharp with urgency. This one is hurt, bad. A younger soldier, barely 20, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger, ran up with a canvas bag marked with a red cross. He dropped to one knee beside Hans, easing him down to sit in the grass with surprising gentleness. Hans wanted to protest, to explain he could stand, but his legs gave out and the world was starting to spin. Easy there, buddy, the medic said, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone who should hate him. He was already cutting away Hans's flight jacket with scissors, exposing the shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Damn, you got chewed up pretty good. Hans flinched as the medic probed the wound, but the American's touch was careful, almost tender, nothing like what he had expected. Where was the brutality? The interrogation? The rifle butt to his face? The revenge for all those American pilots shot down over Germany? Morphine? The medic asked the sergeant. Give it to him. He's no good to intel if he bleeds out. Hans felt the sting of a needle in his thigh, and within seconds, the pain began to recede into a warm, distant fog. The medic was wrapping his shoulder now, talking to him in that soft voice, even though Hans could not understand most of the words. But the tone was like talking to an injured friend, not an enemy. You're going to be okay, Fritz. We'll get you patched up. The sergeant lit a cigarette, an American Lucky Strike, and to Hans's complete shock, offered it to him. Hans took it with a shaking hand, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. It tasted like real tobacco instead of the ersatz garbage they had been smoking in Germany for 2 years. Actual tobacco. The sergeant even held his lighter for him, cupping his hand against the spring breeze like they were comrades sharing a break. What's your name, Kraut? The sergeant asked slowly, as if talking to a child. Lurche, Hans managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Hans Werner Lurche. Well, Lurch, you picked a hell of a day to fall out of the sky. War's almost over anyway. You're lucky you ran into us instead of some of the boys who lost friends to your Luftwaffe. They might not have been so friendly. Hans understood maybe half of that, but he caught the essential message. He was lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. He had expected to be beaten or shot, and instead, an American medic was bandaging his wounds, and a sergeant was sharing cigarettes like they were fellow soldiers instead of enemies. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Medic says we gotta get him to the aid station, one of the soldiers called out. "Load him in the jeep," the sergeant replied, already moving on to other concerns, treating Hans's capture as routine business rather than a moment for revenge. As they carried him across the field on a stretcher, Hans looked back at the burning wreckage of his Messerschmitt. 4 years of war condensed into twisted metal and smoke. He had survived dozens of test flights in experimental aircraft, dodged British Spitfires and American Thunderbolts, pushed prototype jets to their limits, and now it was over. He was alive, wounded but alive, in the hands of men who were supposed to be monsters. The jeep ride to the aid station was a blur of morphine and confusion. Hans drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation in English he could not follow, seeing flashes of devastated German countryside rolling past bombed-out buildings, burned tanks, the detritus of a lost war. At some point, someone gave him water, held the canteen to his lips like he was a child. Another impossible kindness. When he coughed and some spilled down his chin, the soldier just wiped it away and tilted the canteen more carefully. "Easy does it, Captain. Small sips." This was not what Goebbels had promised. This was not the American brutality he had been warned about since 1941. This was something else entirely. And Hans was about to discover it was only the beginning. Hans woke in a bed. Not a cot on a concrete floor, not a pile of straw in some barn. An actual bed with clean white sheets that smelled of soap. His shoulder had been properly bandaged, the pain reduced to a dull, manageable ache. Sunlight streamed through a real glass window, and somewhere nearby, someone was playing American swing music on a phonograph. Glenn Miller, if he was not mistaken. He blinked, trying to orient himself. This was clearly a field hospital, but nothing like the nightmare scenarios he had imagined during the long years of war. The room was clean, organized, staffed by medical personnel who moved with calm efficiency rather than chaos. Other wounded soldiers occupied nearby beds, some American, some German, lying side by side. Nobody was screaming, nobody was being beaten. The Americans and Germans were receiving the same care. A nurse noticed he was awake, a woman in an American Army uniform with captain's bars on her collar. She approached with a clipboard and a professional smile that seemed genuine rather than forced. "Guten Morgen, Captain Lurch," she said in heavily accented but functional German. "I am Captain Morrison. How is the pain this morning?" Hans struggled to sit up, his mind still foggy. "You speak German?" "A little, enough to check on our patients." She examined his dressings with practiced hands, her touch professional but gentle. "You were lucky. The shrapnel missed the major vessels. You will have full use of your arm once it heals. 6 weeks, maybe 8. I do not understand," Hans said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Why are you treating me? I am your enemy." Captain Morrison gave him a puzzled look, as if the question itself was strange. "Because you are wounded, that is what we do." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, as if there was no other possible response to a wounded human being. Over the next 3 days, Hans's confusion only deepened. The Americans fed him the same rations they gave their own wounded, not bread and water, but hot meals with actual meat, vegetables, coffee with real cream, even chocolate bars. When he mentioned he was still hungry after one meal, they brought him more food without hesitation, without using it as leverage or demanding information in exchange. The medical care was meticulous. A surgeon came by daily to check his wound, changing dressings, watching for infection with the kind of careful attention Hans had not seen in German hospitals in years. They gave him penicillin, that miracle drug the Germans had heard about but rarely had access to. Pain medication came regularly, on schedule, not withheld as punishment or leverage. But the biggest shock was how the American staff treated him. Not as an enemy, not even as a prisoner exactly, but as a patient who deserved care. The nurses asked about his comfort. Would he like another blanket? Was the light too bright? Did he need help getting to the latrine? The orderlies helped him wash, helped him dress without shame or cruelty or mockery. One young private, a kid from Iowa named Miller, with an open, friendly face, even tried to teach him English phrases during his rounds, laughing good-naturedly at Hans's terrible pronunciation. "No, no," Miller would say, grinning. It's thank you, not sank you. You gotta make the th sound, see? He would stick his tongue between his teeth to demonstrate, looking ridiculous but patient. Hans tried it, failed miserably, and Miller just laughed and patted his good shoulder. We'll work on it, Captain. You've got time. War's almost over anyway. This casual friendship bewildered Hans most of all. Miller was 19, had probably lost friends to German fighters, had every reason to hate Luftwaffe pilots, yet here he was, treating Hans like a comrade instead of a murderer. Where was the hatred? The desire for revenge? The anger at what Germany had done? On his 4th day in the hospital, a United States Army Air Force officer arrived, a major named Patterson, maybe 40, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. He pulled up a chair beside Hans's bed, moving slowly, deliberately, like someone who had all the time in the world. He opened a folder filled with papers. "Captain Lurch," he said in perfect unaccented German, "I understand you are a test pilot for the Luftwaffe. Quite an experienced one, from what we have gathered." Hans's heart sank. Here it comes, he thought. The interrogation, the pressure, the threats, the moment when the mask of kindness would fall away. "Yes, sir," he said carefully. "I was assigned to the Erprobungsstellen, the test centers." Patterson nodded, studying the papers. "The Reich's aircraft evaluation facilities. You've evaluated most of the Luftwaffe's fighters, I imagine. The Me-262s, the jets?" This was dangerous territory. Hans knew he had to be careful. "I flew many aircraft types, sir. It was my assignment." "I'm sure you did." Patterson leaned back, his tone conversational rather than accusatory, like they were two colleagues discussing work. "Here's the thing, Captain. The war is almost over. Everyone with eyes can see it. Germany is finished. The question now isn't who wins, we know that answer. The question is, what happens next? What happens to men like you?" Hans said nothing, waiting for the trap he was certain was coming. "We've captured a lot of your aircraft," Patterson continued, almost casual. "Jets, rocket planes, experimental designs, fascinating machines. But we need someone who understands these aircraft to help us evaluate them properly. Someone with real experience, not just technical manuals and guesswork." Hans stared at him, not quite believing what he was hearing. You want me to help you?" "I want you to do what you've always done, fly and evaluate aircraft. Except now, you'd be doing it for us instead of the Luftwaffe." Patterson smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "The alternative is sitting in a POW camp until the war officially ends, then getting shipped home to whatever's left of Germany. Your choice." It was not really a choice, and Patterson knew it. But what stunned Hans was the offer itself. The Americans were not torturing him. They were proposing a job. They were acknowledging his expertise. "Why would you trust me?" Hans asked, genuinely confused. "Who said anything about trust?" Patterson's smile widened. "You'll be watched. Armed guards, restricted areas, but we need your skills. And frankly, Captain, you've got nowhere else to go." Hans thought about Hildegard and his daughter, thought about the ruins of Germany, then thought about what he loved most, flying. The Americans were offering him a chance to keep doing what he was born to do. "I will help you," he said quietly. Patterson stood and offered his hand. Hans shook it, feeling the surreal nature of the moment, a Luftwaffe test pilot shaking hands with an American major. Not as enemies, but as colleagues. "Welcome aboard, Captain," Patterson said. "Let's get that shoulder healed up. We've got a lot of aircraft for you to evaluate." The Americans moved Hans to a more secure facility near Frankfurt within a week, but secure turned out to mean something very different than he had imagined. Yes, there were guards and fences and checkpoints, but his quarters were comfortable, the food remained good, and the Americans treated him with consistent professional respect that never wavered. The base commander, Colonel Raymond, was a pragmatist who had flown P-47 Thunderbolts in combat over France. He invited Hans to dinner his first night at the new facility, serving pot roast and potatoes while asking detailed questions about Luftwaffe training methods. Not interrogation, genuine professional curiosity. "Our boys are good pilots," Raymond said, cutting his meat with precise movements. But your Luftwaffe gave us hell for years. I lost 2 wingmen to Bf-109s over France in '44. Good men. What made your training program so effective in the early years?" Hans hesitated, unsure if this was a trap, a trick to make him reveal secrets. But Raymond's face showed only professional interest, one aviator talking to another about the craft they both understood. "We had time," Hans said carefully, still testing the waters. "Early in the war, before everything fell apart, we could train pilots properly. Hundreds of hours of flight time by the end." He shrugged with his good shoulder. "We were sending boys up with 50 hours. They died in days, sometimes hours." Raymond nodded grimly, his expression darkening. "Same story everywhere. War grinds men up faster than you can train them. Doesn't matter which side you're on." He poured Hans a glass of wine, actual wine, not the rotgut that had been available in Germany for years. "Here's to the poor bastards who didn't make it. Ours and yours." They drank to the dead. Hans felt tears prick his eyes, unexpected emotion welling up from somewhere deep. This American colonel had lost friends to German guns, had every reason to hate him, yet here he sat, sharing wine with a Luftwaffe pilot, acknowledging the common humanity of loss. Over the following weeks, Hans met the team he would be working with: American test pilots, engineers, intelligence officers. They were initially wary, which he understood and even respected. But as they worked together, examining captured German aircraft, discussing design philosophies and performance characteristics, something unexpected happened. They became colleagues. There was Captain Jake Larson, a P-51 Mustang pilot who had shot down 4 German fighters over the Rhine. He and Hans spent hours comparing notes on the Bf-109 versus the Mustang, debating the merits of different armaments and engine configurations. Their conversations started stiffly, professionally distant, but soon became animated, even heated 2 professionals dissecting the tools of their trade with the passion of men who understood what it meant to trust your life to a machine at 20,000 feet. "Your 109 turns better than my Mustang at low altitude," Larson admitted one afternoon as they examined a captured Gustav model in the hangar. "But above 20,000 feet, we owned you. You couldn't touch us up there." "The supercharger," Hans agreed, running his hand along the 109's wing. "We never solved that problem properly. And your range, my God, you could fly to Berlin and back. We would run out of fuel after an hour of combat." Larson grinned. "That's what happens when you've got Packard Merlin engines and drop tanks. Though I'll admit, first time I saw a Me-262 jet scream past me, I nearly messed myself. You bastards and your jets almost changed everything." The casual profanity, the easy camaraderie, it felt impossible. They should hate each other. Instead, they were swapping pilot stories like old academy classmates, finding common ground in the shared experience of combat flying. The real breakthrough came when Hans first flew a captured P-51 Mustang. The Americans had one painted in Luftwaffe colors for evaluation, and they asked Hans to put it through its paces. Standing beside the aircraft, this beautiful American fighter that had terrorized German airspace for 2 years, Hans felt a complex mix of emotions churning in his chest. Respect for the machine's elegant design, bitterness at what it had done to his comrades. And underneath it all, the pilot's pure, childlike desire to fly something new. "She's all yours, Captain," Major Patterson said, gesturing to the cockpit like a man offering a gift. "Take her up and tell us what you think. No nonsense, just your honest professional assessment." Hans climbed into the cockpit. The seat fit him perfectly. Americans and Germans weren't so different in size after all. The instruments were logically arranged, easier to read than the cramped German equivalents. He went through the pre-flight checklist with an American engineer translating when necessary, patient as Hans asked questions. Then he fired up the Packard Merlin engine. The sound was incredible, a deep, powerful roar that vibrated through the airframe, thrumming in his chest. German engines had their own music, their own character, but this was something else entirely. This was American industrial might condensed into 12 cylinders of raw power. Hans taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and opened the throttle. The Mustang leaped forward like a thoroughbred released from the gate. The acceleration was asterisk, asterisk, brutal, violent, asterisk, asterisk, pinning him back in his seat harder than any German fighter ever had. He was airborne in seconds, climbing at a rate that made him laugh out loud despite himself, despite everything. Good God, this thing could climb! For the next 40 minutes, Hans forgot the war, forgot his wounded shoulder, forgot being a prisoner. He just flew. He pushed the Mustang through every maneuver he knew. Loops, rolls, high-speed dives, tight turns that pulled G-forces until his vision tunneled. He tested the stall characteristics, the control response, the incredible visibility from the bubble canopy, magnificent, so much better than the claustrophobic 109 cockpit. He even attempted some combat maneuvers, imagining how he would have fought against his former comrades in this machine. It was exhilarating and sobering. This was what they had been up against. This was why Germany lost the air war. When he landed, Patterson and Larson were waiting on the tarmac, eager for his assessment. "Well?" Patterson asked. "What do you think?" Hans climbed out of the cockpit, his face flushed with the pure joy of flight, his heart still racing. "It is a beautiful machine," he said honestly, "superior to the Bf-109 in almost every measurable way. The visibility, the range, the engine power at high altitude, it is remarkable, truly remarkable engineering. What about weaknesses?" Larson pressed, curious. "Every aircraft has them. The roll rate at very high speed could be better," Hans said thoughtfully. "And the ammunition load is lighter than I'd prefer for ground attack missions. But as a pure fighter, as an air superiority platform," he shook his head admiringly. "In the hands of a good pilot, it is devastating. We knew this, of course. We felt it every day in the sky. But actually flying one." He paused, searching for words in his limited English. "Now I understand why we lost." It was a moment of brutal honesty. These Americans had given him the chance to fly their finest fighter, and he had responded with unvarnished truth instead of pride. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. He was not just a prisoner helping his captors. He was a test pilot doing what test pilots do, evaluating aircraft objectively without national bias. Over dinner that night in the officers' mess, the walls came down even further. Larson produced a photo of his girlfriend back in Michigan, showing it around with obvious pride. "Sarah," he said softly, "we're getting married when I get home. If I get home on time, she's already threatening to start without me." The other pilots laughed. Another pilot, Lieutenant Morrison, pulled out pictures of his 2 kids. "Jenny's 7 now. Tommy's 5. Haven't seen them in 18 months. They probably won't even recognize me." Hans felt in his flight suit pocket they had returned his personal effects after initial processing and pulled out his own creased photograph. Hildegard holding their 3-year-old daughter, both smiling at the camera on some sunny day that felt like another lifetime. "My family," he said simply, his voice thick. The Americans passed it around the table, looking at the photo with the same tenderness they had shown their own. No sneers, no mockery, no jokes about the enemy. Just men recognizing that the enemy pilot also had people waiting for him. "Beautiful wife," Morrison said quietly. "Your daughter looks just like her." "She is 3, Hans said, struggling with the English words. She will not remember me if I am gone too long." "You'll get back to them," Larson said firmly. "War's almost done. They're already processing prisoners for repatriation. You'll be home before you know it, telling her stories about the crazy Americans you met." Hans wanted to believe that with every fiber of his being. But more than the promise of home, what struck him most was the compassion in these men's voices. They were not guards and prisoner, not victors and vanquished. They were fathers and husbands, pilots and professionals, understanding each other's fears and hopes across the divide of nationality. That night, lying in his bunk, Hans tried to process everything. Every day brought new proof that the propaganda had been lies. The Americans were not monsters. They were professionals who took their job seriously but never forgot their humanity. They followed rules, even when it would have been easier not to. They showed respect to an enemy pilot who had helped kill their friends, not because they were weak, but because they believed in something larger than revenge. This was not mercy born of weakness. This was discipline, conviction, strength. Hans began to question everything he had been told, not just about the war, but about what it meant to have honor. Maybe Germany hadn't lost just to American machines. Maybe they had lost to American values. Values that said a wounded enemy deserved care, that a prisoner deserved food, that a test pilot deserved the chance to keep flying. The Americans were showing him something more powerful than any weapon, the possibility that there was a better way to be human. And Hans Werner Lerche, shot down over the Rhine and expecting death, was beginning to believe it. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Hans heard the news in the officers' mess at the base near Frankfurt, surrounded by American pilots who cheered, embraced, and wept with relief. They had survived. The war in Europe was over. Hans sat quietly at his table, processing what this meant. Germany had been completely defeated. His nation lay in ruins. Everything he had fought for had been for nothing or worse than nothing, given what was now coming to light about the camps, the atrocities, the systematic murder that had been happening while he flew his test missions. But his work with the Americans continued. If anything, it accelerated. With the war officially over, restrictions eased. Hans evaluated dozens of captured German aircraft over the following months, not just fighters, but experimental designs, rocket planes, and jets that had never entered production. His reports were detailed, honest, and invaluable to American engineers trying to understand how German aviation had advanced even in the chaos of defeat. More than technical data, Hans provided context. He explained the design philosophies, the resource constraints, the desperate gambles taken as Germany's situation deteriorated. He told them which projects had been genuinely promising and which were propaganda fantasies' last-ditch hopes with no basis in reality. Then in August, just 3 months after surrender, Major Patterson came to him with a proposal that seemed impossible. "Captain Lurch," Patterson said, sitting across from him in a private office, "we've been impressed with your work. Very impressed. The Navy's test pilot program has authorized me to offer you a position." Hans looked at him blankly. "A position?" "As a civilian contractor, not as a prisoner, as an employee. You'd be released from POW status immediately, granted special immigration status, and allowed to bring your family to the United States." Patterson slid papers across the desk. "It's not charity. We need your expertise as we develop our own jet program. You'd be working alongside our test pilots, evaluating both German and American aircraft, contributing to research that will shape aviation for the next decade." Hans stared at the papers, unable to process what was being offered. "You want me to come to America? To stay? We want you to keep doing what you do best, fly and evaluate aircraft. The only difference is you'll be doing it in America, with American citizenship as a possibility down the line with your family safe and provided for." Patterson leaned back. "I won't lie to you, there will be Germans who see this as betrayal. But Germany is going to be occupied and divided for years. Your aviation industry is being dismantled. There won't be any test flying jobs for German pilots for a very long time. This is your chance to keep flying, to support your family, to build a future." Hans thought about it for 3 days. He wrote to Hildegard, explaining the offer as best he could in censored letters. Her response came 2 weeks later. The letter was practical, unflinchingly honest. "We have nothing left here, Hans. The house is destroyed. I am living with my parents in one room. There is barely any food. Your daughter asks about you every day, but soon she will not remember your face. If the Americans will take us, we should go. Germany needs time to heal, but we need to survive." In December 1946, Hans Werner Lerch signed the papers. He became one of the first former Luftwaffe officers to work officially for the United States military. He was not unique. Operation Paperclip would bring hundreds of German scientists and engineers to America, but Hans represented something different. He was not a rocket scientist building weapons of the future. He was a pilot, an evaluator, a man whose expertise was welcomed, but whose humanity mattered just as much. The Americans flew Hildegard and his daughter to the United States in early 1947. Hans met them at the airport in Washington, D.C., the first time he had seen them in nearly 2 years. 2 years of letters and photographs and hoping, but no touch, no certainty. His daughter was 5 now. She hung back shyly, holding her mother's hand, studying this stranger in American clothes who claimed to be her father. She had been 3 when he left. He had missed her 4th birthday, her first day of school, 2 years of her life that he could never get back. But Hildegard threw her arms around him and wept. She buried her face in his shoulder and shook with sobs that came from somewhere deep, from the fear and uncertainty and impossible hope of the past 2 years. Hans held her, his own tears flowing freely, not caring who saw. "I didn't know if I would ever see you again," she whispered in German against his chest. "Every day I didn't know." "I am here," he said, his voice breaking. "We are here. We made it." Eventually, his daughter came to him slowly at first, testing, but then she smiled, a shy, tentative smile, and called him Papa. Hans picked her up, feeling how much she had grown, how much he had missed, and made a silent promise that he would never leave them again. They settled near Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland. The Navy provided housing, a small house in a neighborhood where other military families lived. It wasn't much, but compared to bombed-out Germany, it was paradise. Running water, electricity, stores with food, neighbors who were curious but not hostile. Hans flew experimental aircraft for the Navy, contributing to the development of jet fighters that would serve in Korea and beyond. His colleagues were former enemies, American pilots who had fought the Luftwaffe, but they became friends, real friends. They had their children over for dinner. They celebrated holidays together. They formed the kind of bonds only survivors understand. Hans never forgot what the Americans had done for him. In interviews decades later, he would speak with visible emotion about those first days after capture, the medical care given without hesitation, the decency shown when brutality would have been easier, the respect given to a man who had helped kill their comrades. "I could have ended up in Soviet hands," he would say, his German accent still faint after decades in America. "Russian soldiers were just 30 kilometers away when I was shot down. If my aircraft had gone down a little further east, I would have been captured by them instead." He would pause, the weight of that alternate history heavy in his silence. "I heard stories from Luftwaffe pilots who ended up in Soviet camps. Starvation, forced labor in Siberia. Many did not come back. Those who did," he would shake his head, "they were broken men. Instead, I fell into American custody and they saved my life. Not just physically, they gave me a future when I had no right to expect one. They gave my family a future. That sergeant who lowered his rifle and called for a medic instead of shooting me, I never learned his name, but he changed everything with that one decision." Hans maintained lifelong contact with many of the Americans he worked with during those crucial months. Major Patterson became a lifelong friend, visiting Hans and his family regularly, even after both men retired. They would sit on Hans's porch in Maryland, drinking beer and talking about the old days, about aircraft they had flown, about the strange twist of fate that had turned them from enemies into brothers. Captain Jake Larson, the Mustang pilot who had once been wary of working with a former Luftwaffe ace, stood as godfather to Hans's second child, born in America in 1949. At the christening, Larson gave a short speech Hans would never forget. "We were enemies for 4 years, Larson said, holding the baby with the awkward care of a man unused to infants. "We fought each other in the skies over Europe. We tried to kill each other, that's just the truth of it. But we've been friends for 4 years now, and I hope we'll be friends for 40 more. I think that says something important about doing things the right way, even in war. Especially in war." The room was quiet after that, Americans and Germans both processing the weight of those words. Then Hans's daughter, now 7 years old and thoroughly American, broke the silence by asking loudly when they could eat cake, and everyone laughed. The moment passed, but Hans never forgot it. He thought often of Larson's words, "Doing things the right way even in war, especially in war." Hans Werner Lurche worked as a test pilot until 1963, when he retired at age 54. By then, he had flown over 150 different aircraft types for 3 air forces, the Luftwaffe, the United States Navy, and later as a civilian contractor for NASA. He had contributed to the development of jet fighters, carrier operations, and early supersonic flight research. The boy from Württemberg, who had started flying gliders in the 1930s, had become a bridge between eras and nations, between enemies and allies, between war and peace. His daughter grew up thoroughly American, attended American schools, and married an American Navy pilot, continuing the family tradition. His grandchildren would be purely American, with only stories and old photographs connecting them to Germany and the war that had shaped their grandfather's life. Yet Hans made sure they knew those stories. He made sure they understood why they mattered. Your grandfather was treated well because Americans believe in certain principles, he would tell them. Even in war, even with enemies who had done terrible things, there are rules. There is dignity. This is what makes America different. Not that Americans are perfect, but that they try to live up to their ideals even when it is difficult. In 1985, a military historian interviewed Hans for an oral history project about test pilots. Near the end, she asked what he had learned from fighting for Germany and then working for America. Hans was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. At 76, his face was lined with age, his hair white, but his eyes were still sharp, still carrying the intensity of a man who had spent his life pushing machines and himself to their limits. I learned that the values a nation claims to hold are tested not in how it treats its friends, but in how it treats its enemies, he said finally. Germany claimed to be superior, claimed to represent civilization and culture. But we treated our enemies and even many of our own people with brutality. America claimed to believe in human dignity and rule of law, and they actually lived up to those claims even when it was inconvenient. He paused, then continued softly. I also learned that showing mercy is not the same as being weak. The Americans who captured me were not soft. They had just won the most destructive war in history. They were strong enough to win, but also disciplined enough to follow their own rules about how prisoners should be treated. That is real strength. That is the kind of strength that builds something lasting. The interviewer pressed, "Do you think American treatment of prisoners affected the outcome of the war?" Hans didn't hesitate. Absolutely. When German soldiers knew they would be treated fairly if they surrendered to Americans, they surrendered more readily in the final months. When German pilots knew they would receive medical care instead of execution, they were less likely to fight to the death. American humanity was a weapon not in a cynical way, but in a very practical way. It saved American lives by encouraging Germans to give up. He leaned forward, emphasizing his next point. And after the war, it won the peace. Germany became America's ally because Germans remembered how we were treated. We remembered the medical care, the food, the respect. We remembered that America offered us a future instead of revenge. That memory shaped post-war Germany more than any treaty could have. Hans Werner Lerche died on February 13th, 2003, at age 84, surrounded by family in his Maryland home. His obituary appeared in aviation magazines around the world, noting his contributions to test aviation and his unique position as a bridge between former enemies. At his funeral, several elderly American pilots attended, men who had fought against the Luftwaffe, then worked alongside Hans, and later became his lifelong friends. They stood with Hans's American children and grandchildren, 3 generations who existed because one American sergeant had lowered his rifle and chosen compassion over revenge. One of them, Jake Larson, now in his 80s himself, spoke at the service. Hans used to say he got shot down over the Rhine and landed in America, Larson said, his voice still strong despite his age. He meant it literally that day in March 1945 when his Messerschmitt went down and he parachuted into that field. But he also meant it figuratively. We gave him a chance to become American, not just in citizenship, but in spirit, and he took it. He became one of us. Larson paused, looking at the flag-draped casket. That's what made us win the peace, not just the war. We didn't destroy our enemies, we transformed them into allies. Hans was living proof that it works. That doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when revenge would feel better, pays dividends for generations. In March 1945, Hans Werner Lerche expected to die. Bailing out over enemy territory, wounded and terrified, he had been taught that Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture and death. Instead, he found humanity in the most unexpected place. A sergeant who lowered his rifle and called for help. A medic who bandaged his wounds with gentle hands. Officers who recognized his expertise and offered him purpose instead of punishment. Pilots who became colleagues, then friends, then family. Hans lived 58 more years after that moment. He raised a family in the country that had been his enemy. He helped America maintain its air superiority for generations. He became living proof that enemies can become friends. When principles guide actions, when mercy is seen as strength, not weakness. He never forgot the moment that sergeant lowered his rifle. That split-second decision rippled through 6 decades, changing one man's life, changing his children's lives, changing the world in small but meaningful ways. This was not just one sergeant's kindness. This was American military doctrine honoring the Geneva Convention even when enemies did not. It was a conscious choice to win the peace by transforming rather than destroying. Hans Werner Lerche expected death over the Rhine Valley in 1945. He found humanity instead. And in that humanity, he found a future for himself, for his family, and for the alliance between former enemies that kept peace in Europe for generations. Do you have a family story of World War II? Of prisoners of war? Of enemies who became friends? Of small acts of kindness that changed everything? Share in the comments below. These human stories remind us why principles matter even in the darkest times. Next week, we'll share another untold story from World War II. Subscribe so you don't miss it. In 1946, a starving 12-year-old German boy broke into an American military base to steal bread. The soldier who caught him had every right to arrest him, even shoot him. Instead, he did something that would change both their lives forever. This is the true story of how one act of mercy turned enemies into family. The bread is still warm in Klaus Fischer's hands when the flashlight beam catches him. He freezes in the alley behind the American Supply Depot in Frankfurt, half of a loaf of white bread clutched against his chest like stolen gold. The light blinds him. He cannot see the soldier's face, only the dark outline of an American uniform and the rifle slung across his back. This is it. This is how I die. The soldier steps closer. Klaus's legs will not move. His older brother Heinrich's warning echoes in his mind. They will shoot you for taking so much as an apple. These are the same monsters who bombed our cities, Klaus. They have no mercy. But Klaus's mother has not eaten in 3 days, not since she traded her wedding ring for black market flour. His little sister Greta cries herself to sleep every night, her stomach so empty it has started to swell. What choice did he have? The American says something in English, harsh, guttural sounds Klaus cannot understand. The soldier is maybe 25, with dark hair and tired eyes that seem older than his face. He is walking closer now, one hand reaching out. Klaus braces for the blow. Instead, the soldier's fingers touch the bread gently, almost carefully. He does not rip it away. He does not strike. He just looks at it. Then at Klaus. Then back at the bread. You hungry? The soldier asks in broken, heavily accented German. Klaus nods, because what else can he do? His whole body is shaking from cold, from fear, from the 3 pounds he has lost this month alone. The American does something Klaus will replay in his mind 1,000 times over the next 70 years. He breaks off a piece of the bread, hands it back to Klaus, points to the depot kitchen door. Tomorrow, morning, you come, work. Klaus stares at the bread in his hand, then at the soldier, then back at the bread. It is a trap. They are cruel. They want to humiliate me before they punish me. But the soldier is already walking away, back toward the depot entrance. He stops at the door, turns, and says one more word Klaus will never forget. Promise. Klaus did not know it yet, but that piece of bread would feed him for the next 70 years. Klaus does not go to the depot the next morning. He sits in the corner of their shared room, 3 families crammed into half of a destroyed building in the Norden district, the bread divided into careful portions. A piece for Mama, a piece for Greta, a piece for himself. He chews slowly, making it last, tasting real flour for the first time in months. The other families eye their portions hungrily, but no one asks where it came from. It was a trick. He was mocking me. If I go back, they will be waiting to arrest me. But the bread runs out by evening. Greta is crying again, that weak, exhausted sound of a body giving up. And Klaus cannot stop thinking about the soldier's face. Not angry, not disgusted. Just tired. And maybe sad. Tomorrow, he had said, you come, work. Klaus had been taught to expect monsters. In the junior Hitler, youth boys too young for the main organization, his instructor Herr Vogel had shown them posters plastered on every Frankfurt street corner. Hook-nosed demons in American uniforms dragging German children away, behind the enemy powers. The Jew. Another showing Giz with the slogan, they will defile our women, execute our children. This is the price of their Jewish master's revenge. Klaus had believed every word. His father had died in the firebombing of March 1944, crushed under rubble, while Klaus and his family huddled in a shelter 4 blocks away. 11-year-old Klaus had helped identify his body by his wedding ring. His mother moved them to her sister's farm outside Wiesbaden, where they survived the final year eating potato peels and foraged plants. His uncle marched off with the People's Militia in March 1945, a 62-year-old man with a hunting rifle facing American tanks. They never found his body. When the Americans arrived, Klaus had hidden in the root cellar with Greta and his mother, waiting for the screams Herr Vogel promised would come. But the screams never came. Instead, there was quiet, then voices in English. Then his mother emerged to find American soldiers setting up a field hospital in the village square, treating German civilians alongside their own wounded. Klaus had not known what to make of it. They had returned to Frankfurt's ruins in July 1945. Their apartment building was gone, just bricks and twisted metal and memories turned to ash. And the hunger, constant, gnawing hunger that turned food into an obsession, a dream, a fairy tale from the time before. The American Depot had opened in their district in early 1946 warehouses full of food Klaus could smell from blocks away. The scent of real bread, of yeast and butter, things that belonged to his grandmother's kitchen before the war. It drove him mad. He had tried stealing twice before. Once, a British soldier boxed his ears and sent him running. The second time, he had dropped a tin of beans, watching it split open across the cobblestones while he wept with frustration. Last night, he had been so sure he had finally gotten it right, until he had run straight into Private James Crawford of Louisville, Kentucky. Klaus goes the next morning. He approaches the depot from the front this time, in daylight, his heart hammering so hard he thinks it might crack his ribs. The American guard at the gate, a giant with red hair and freckles, looks down at him and says something in English. Klaus stammers. Soldier, yesterday. He said, work? The guard laughs. Actually laughs, a booming sound that makes Klaus flinch and waves him through. Points toward the kitchen building. They are all in on it. They have been waiting. But when Klaus pushes open the kitchen door, there is only one person inside. The same soldier from last night, standing at a steel counter cutting vegetables with a knife that could split Klaus in half. Private Crawford looks up. His face breaks into a smile, a real smile, reaching his eyes. You came, he says in that broken German. Good boy. Klaus stands rigid in the doorway, ready to run. Crawford sets down the knife carefully, deliberately, where Klaus can see it is no longer in his hand. He walks to a shelf and pulls down an apron, adult-sized. It will drown Klaus, and holds it out. You work, Crawford says, gesturing to the potatoes piled on the counter. You eat. Fair, yes? Klaus does not move. Cannot move. His brain is screaming contradictions. He is setting a trap, but he is smiling. They torture children, but he put down the knife. Americans are monsters, but he fed me yesterday. Crawford sighs. He picks up one of the potatoes, pulls out a peeler, and begins demonstrating in exaggerated slow motion, peel, rinse, cut. Peel, rinse, cut. He slides the peeler across the counter toward Klaus. You try. Show me. Klaus's hands shake as he picks up the peeler. He has peeled thousands of potatoes in his life. It has been the bulk of his diet for 2 years, but under Crawford's gaze, he fumbles. The peeler slips. A thin line of blood wells up on his thumb. He jerks back, expecting punishment for being clumsy, mockery for being weak. Crawford makes a soft sound, "Ah, hell," and moves quickly, but not to strike. He grabs a clean cloth, runs it under the tap, and reaches for Klaus's hand. Klaus pulls away instinctively. Crawford stops, holds the cloth out, does not advance further. "It is okay," he says softly. "Let me see. I help. I help." Not "I order," not "you must." "I help." Klaus slowly, so slowly, extends his hand. Crawford's touch is gentle as he wraps the cloth around Klaus's thumb, applying just enough pressure to stop the bleeding. His hands are warm, calloused from work, not soft like Klaus expected from Americans he had been told lived in luxury while Germans starved. "There," Crawford says. "Okay now, try again, slow, I show you better." He demonstrates again, this time standing beside Klaus, guiding his hands without forcing them. Peel, rinse, cut. Peel, rinse, cut. When Klaus completes his first potato successfully, Crawford pats his shoulder a brief, firm touch. "Good, very good." Klaus blinks back tears he does not understand. They work in silence for an hour. Crawford does not push conversation, does not ask questions. He just works alongside Klaus, occasionally correcting his technique, once bringing over a stool when he notices Klaus struggling to reach the counter comfortably. At midday, Crawford pulls out 2 plates. He fills both with the stew he has been preparing, thick with meat and vegetables, more food than Klaus has seen in one place since 1944. He sets 1 plate in front of Klaus. They eat together. The meat is unlike anything Klaus remembers. Rich, tender, swimming in gravy that soaks into the bread, Crawford tears from a fresh loaf. Klaus tries to eat slowly, tries to maintain some dignity, but his body betrays him. He is shoveling food into his mouth, sauce dripping down his chin. Crawford does not laugh, does not comment, just slides his own bread across the table so Klaus can mop up the last of the gravy. When Klaus finally looks up, tears streaming down his face from gratitude or shame or confusion, he cannot tell Crawford is watching him with an expression Klaus has never seen directed at him before from an adult who is not his mother. Compassion. "You have family?" Crawford asks carefully. "Mother? Father? Sister? Brother?" "Mother," Klaus whispers. "Sister. Small. 6 years." Crawford nods slowly. Then he stands, walks to the supply closet, and pulls out a canvas bag. He fills it methodically. A loaf of bread, a tin of meat, a jar of preserves, a small sack of flour. Things that would cost a month's rations on the black market. Things worth more than his mother's wedding ring. He holds out the bag. Klaus stares at it. At him. Back at the bag. "Why? Why are you doing this?" "For your family," Crawford says. "You come tomorrow, work again. Every day you work, you take food home, yes?" "Why?" The word comes out before Klaus can stop it, in German. "Warum?" Crawford's face shifts something painful, passing across it like a shadow. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a photograph, creased and worn. He shows it to Klaus, a woman with dark hair and a boy, maybe 8 years old, both smiling at the camera. "My wife," Crawford says quietly. "My son, Tommy. Same age as your sister when I leave for war." He traces the boy's face with his finger. "I think, if my Tommy is hungry, if he needs to steal food to eat, I hope someone helps him. Someone is kind. Yes?" Klaus takes the bag with trembling hands. "Danke," he whispers. Crawford smiles. "Tomorrow. You come tomorrow." Klaus runs home with the bag clutched to his chest, the weight of it more valuable than gold. But it is not the food that makes him cry as he runs through the ruined streets of Frankfurt. It is the photograph of a little boy named Tommy, and the way Crawford's voice had broken when he had said, "I hope someone is kind." Klaus comes back the next day, and the next, and the next. At first, He is still waiting for the trap to spring. He works quickly, efficiently, barely speaking except to acknowledge instructions. He takes the food Crawford gives him and leaves as soon as he is allowed. He does not ask questions, does not make eye contact longer than necessary. Stay useful. Do not give him a reason to change his mind. But Crawford is consistent. Every day, the same routine. Work, eat together, take food home. And every day, Crawford talks to him just small things at first. About the weather, about the work. Simple German phrases Crawford is learning, laughing at his own terrible pronunciation. Stories about Kentucky that make no sense to Klaus, something called bluegrass, and horses running in circles for sport. Klaus starts arriving earlier, staying later. He learns the routine so well that Crawford can step away and trust Klaus to continue the work. He learns to anticipate what is needed ingredients pulled out before Crawford asks, utensils cleaned and ready, stations prepped for the day's cooking. He starts asking questions, careful ones at first. What is this? Pointing to an unfamiliar vegetable. How do you make this? Watching Crawford prepare dishes Klaus has never seen. Crawford answers every question with patience, often supplementing his broken German with exaggerated pantomime that makes Klaus crack his first genuine smile in over a year. For 2 weeks, Klaus returned every morning. Then one day, a sergeant stormed into the kitchen. Another soldier enters while they are working a tall man with sergeant's stripes who starts speaking rapidly in English, gesturing at Klaus. Klaus goes rigid. This is it. Someone noticed. Someone complained. The sergeant's voice rises. Crawford's voice rises to meet it. They are arguing. Klaus can tell from the tone even though he cannot understand the words. The sergeant points at the door. Crawford steps between Klaus and the sergeant, his body forming a barrier. Finally, the sergeant throws up his hands and storms out. Crawford turns to Klaus, his face flushed. You okay? He struggles for words in German. He says rules. I say. He makes a dismissive gesture. You stay. You work here. Okay? You. Klaus's voice is tiny. You fought for me? Crawford looks surprised by the question. Of course, you are a good worker. You, good kid. Something cracks in Klaus's chest. He is 12 years old. He has survived a war. He has watched his city burn. He is stolen to keep his sister alive, and now an American soldier is calling him a good kid and defending him against his own sergeant. Everything they told me was a lie. The realization hits him all at once. Like the moment the firebomb hit his building, that same sense of his world shattering and reshaping into something unrecognizable. Crawford mistakes his silence for fear. Hey, it is okay. You are safe here, I promise, okay? Okay, Klaus whispers. Klaus would later say the sergeant's visit was the moment he stopped being afraid. But that morning, standing in that kitchen with Crawford's hand on his shoulder, he felt something he had not felt since before his father died. Safe. One morning in early May, a group of German men, former soldiers, Klaus recognizes them by their bearing, even in civilian clothes, stand outside the depot fence, calling out insults, "Traitor boy! American pet! You betray your people for scraps!" Klaus feels shame burn in his stomach. But Crawford's hand lands on his shoulder. They are wrong, Crawford says firmly. You are not a traitor. You survive. You help your family. That is not shame. That is brave. But listen. Crawford crouches down to Klaus's eye level. War over. Germany lost. I am not happy about war. You are not happy about war. But war over now. Now we. He struggles for the word, then makes a building motion with his hands. Now we build again. Together. Yes? They say Americans are... Klaus catches himself. The words from his training are still there, trying to surface. Americans are gangsters. Americans are Jewish puppets. Americans are... Say what? Crawford prompts gently. Klaus shakes his head. Nothing. They are wrong. They. He takes a breath. You are not what they say. Crawford's smile is sad. We are not all good. Some American soldiers, they... He makes a gesture Klaus interprets as not kind. Some are bad, Some are good, like all people. Like Germans, some are bad, some are good. Yes, it is the simplest thing anyone has ever said to Klaus, and it unravels everything. Some are good, some are bad. Like all people. Not monsters, not demons, not a monolithic force of evil descending on Germany to destroy it. Just people. Crawford's friend taught Klaus English during lunch breaks. Klaus was hungry for it, desperate to understand. He was good at it too, his young brain absorbing the new language faster than Crawford could believe. In late May, Crawford brings forms applications for the German youth school the occupation authorities have established. He has already filled out most of it. You work morning, go school afternoon. I talk to your mother, explain, okay? But school important, Crawford insists. You smart, you need education. Cannot work kitchen forever, must have future. Klaus's eyes sting. You want me to leave? No! Crawford looks horrified. No, I want you to have good life, big life, better than. He gestures at the kitchen, the depot, the ruins outside. Better than this. That night, Klaus tells his mother everything. About the stealing, about Crawford, about the job, about the school forms. He expects anger for lying, for putting himself at risk, for working for the occupiers. Instead, Anna Fischer weeps. She pulls Klaus into her arms. She is so thin now, he can feel every bone and whispers, Danky Gott, Danky Gott. The next morning, she comes with him to meet Crawford. She is wearing her best dress, patched and faded, but clean. She has combed her hair. She is trying to have dignity in front of the American who has been feeding her children. Crawford shakes her hand formally, speaks slowly in his broken German. Your son, very good worker. Very smart. You have good boy. Anna's voice shakes. I cannot pay you. I have nothing to... No pay needed. Crawford interrupts gently. He work. I feed. That is pay. And... He holds out a larger bag than usual, filled with rations, flour, sugar, canned milk, coffee. For you, for your family. Anna takes the bag with trembling hands. Then, before Crawford can react, she kisses his hand, a gesture of profound gratitude Klaus has only seen in church. Bit, she whispers. Bit, danky. Thank you. Thank you. Crawford's eyes are wet. He carefully extricates his hand and instead offers a handshake firm, respectful, between equals. You welcome, he says. Your son, he good boy. He make you proud. Walking home, Anna holds Klaus's hand, something she has not done since he was small. This man, she says quietly, this American, he is a good man. Yes, Klaus agrees. They lied to us about everything. Yes. She stops walking, looks at him directly. You must remember this, Klaus. You must remember that when they tell you someone is your enemy, when they tell you to hate people you have never met, when they tell you the world is simple and clear, they are lying. Do you understand? Klaus nods. I understand, Mama. Good. She squeezes his hand. Now you take this gift, this job, this food, this chance to go to school again, and you use it. You build a good life, a life that would make your father proud. I will, Klaus promises. I will. Crawford rotated home in August 1946. Klaus did not know it was his last day until Crawford told him that morning, his face carefully neutral. I go back to America tomorrow. Back to my wife, my son. But you. He gestured at Klaus, at the kitchen where Klaus now worked with confidence, at the school books Klaus brought to read during slow periods. You continue. You strong now. You have future. Klaus wanted to cry, but was 12 and trying to be a man. His English was better now, but still halting. I not forget. You save my life. My family's life. Crawford shook his head firmly. No, you save your life. You brave enough to come back that second day. You brave enough to trust. He struggled for words. I just try to be kind. That all. He pulled out an envelope. Inside was a letter of recommendation, written in careful English, describing Klaus as a reliable, hard-working, intelligent young man suitable for any future employment. At the bottom was Crawford's address in Kentucky. "You write me," Crawford said. "Tell me when you finish school. Tell me about your life, okay?" "Okay," Klaus whispered. They shook hands, the same formal handshake Crawford had given Klaus's mother, between equals. Remember Crawford's photograph of Tommy? That photo would travel back to Kentucky with Klaus 43 years later. Klaus Fischer attended the occupation school, then technical college. He became an electrical engineer, working on the reconstruction of Frankfurt's infrastructure. In 1952, he wrote his first letter to Crawford, telling him about his graduation, about Greta starting school herself, about his mother, who was healthy again, working as a seamstress. Crawford wrote back with a photograph. Him and Tommy, both smiling, Tommy now a teenager. "I told him about you," Crawford wrote. "About the brave boy who came back even when he was afraid. He wants to meet you someday." They corresponded for 47 years. Klaus visited Kentucky once in 1989, bringing his own 2 daughters to meet the man who had changed his life. Crawford was gray-haired now, retired, but he had never stopped cooking. He made Klaus and his daughters the same stew he had made that first day, thick with meat and vegetables, served with fresh bread. "Still best food I ever taste," Klaus told him, and they had both laughed. When Crawford died in 1993, Klaus flew back to Kentucky for the funeral. He stood before the gathered family and friends, most of them strangers, and told them about a night in 1946 when a hungry boy tried to steal bread and found something more valuable than food. "He gave me back my humanity," Klaus said, his English now fluent but still carrying the accent of his youth. "When everything I had been taught was cruelty, when I expected punishment, he gave me dignity, he gave me work, he gave me hope. He did not see a German child, an enemy child. He saw a hungry boy, and he fed him. This one man's kindness, this one man's kindness, this one man's kindness." Tommy Crawford gray-haired himself now. Klaus's age embraced him after the service. "Dad told me stories about you my whole life. He said you taught him something too, that kindness is not just about grand gestures. Sometimes it is just about seeing someone who is hungry and sharing your bread." Klaus returned to Germany and spent the next decade giving talks at schools about the occupation period, about reconciliation, about the importance of seeing humanity in people you have been taught to fear. "I was taught that Americans were monsters," he would tell students. "And then I met one American soldier, and everything I had been taught fell apart, not because he made speeches about peace, because he was kind when he had every reason not to be." Klaus Fischer died in 2016 at the age of 82. His obituary mentioned his work as an engineer, his family, his contributions to German-American friendship societies. But in his desk, his daughters found a box containing every letter Crawford had sent him, the photograph of Tommy from that first day in the kitchen, and a piece of paper worn soft from folding and unfolding. It was Crawford's letter of recommendation, written in careful English in 1946. At the bottom, in faded pencil, Klaus had written in German, "The day I learned that kindness is stronger than hate." His daughters donated the collection to the German Historical Museum in Berlin, where it is now part of an exhibition on the post-war period. School children stand in front of the display, reading the letters, looking at the photographs, learning about a boy who stole bread and a soldier who chose compassion. The final letter in the collection, written by Klaus to Crawford's widow after Crawford's death, contains one line that museum curators often quote, "Your husband taught me that we are not defined by who we are told to hate, but by who we choose to help. This is the only lesson worth teaching, the only legacy worth leaving. Tell your children, tell your grandchildren, when you see someone hungry, feed them. When you see someone afraid, comfort them. When you see someone who expects cruelty, give them kindness instead. This is how we build a better world, not with grand declarations, but with one person, one moment, one choice at a time." The bread Klaus stole that night in 1946 cost maybe 20 cents in American money. The life it led to was beyond price. Appreciate you watching. Hope you learned something cool today. Hit that like button, share it with friends, and I will see you in the next video.